A whisper before the storm. There are stories that start with fireworks, grand gestures, or unforgettable first meetings, but this story, it began in silence. Not the kind of silence that feels empty or awkward. It was the kind that wraps itself around a moment like a soft blanket, warm, familiar, and full of things left unsaid. It was in a small town nestled between hills and lavender fields. A place where time moved a little slower, where the streets held memories in their cobblestones and everyone knew each other's name. San Felice wasn't on any major map, but for the people who lived there, it was the whole world. And for her, it was home. Laura had lived in San Felice since she was born. She was the kind of woman people noticed, not because she was loud or extravagant, but because of the quiet strength in her eyes. Her beauty wasn't the kind that screamed for attention, but rather the kind that lingered. Soft, chestnut hair, often braided loosely over her shoulder. Warm, amber eyes that always seemed to be looking just a little deeper than everyone else's. She had a gentle way of speaking, but when she laughed, it filled the room with light. She worked at a local bookstore cafe, a cozy little place with old wooden shelves and mismatched chairs. The kind of place where regulars came not just for the coffee, but for the conversations. Laura loved books because they held truths people didn't always know how to say out loud. She often wondered if her life would ever feel like one of the stories she read. Then he came back, Miguel. He wasn't from San Felice originally, but he had once called it home. Years ago, he arrived with his mother, a stern woman with sharp opinions, after a painful divorce. Miguel was different back then, restless, quick-tempered, always looking at the horizon like it was calling his name. He had eyes the color of rain clouds and a jawline that made people do a double-take, but it was the sadness he carried that made him unforgettable. They met when they were just teenagers, two very different worlds colliding in the quiet of a sleepy town. While Laura lived in predictability, Miguel lived in questions. She found safety in roots, he craved wings. Still, they found something in each other that felt unshakably real, the kind of bond that didn't need explanation. But life, as it often does, got in the way. He left, without warning, without goodbye, and she stayed, holding all the words she never got to say. Years passed, seasons changed, people moved on. But not Laura. She continued her life in San Felice, filling her days with coffee, books, and helping her father take care of the small house at the edge of the town. Some days the pain dulled, other days it screamed. But she never told anyone. Instead, she smiled. She always smiled, until the day she saw him again. It was a regular Tuesday morning. The kind where the town still smelled of fresh bread and the sound of bicycles filled the air. Laura had just opened the cafe when the bell above the door rang. She turned and froze. There he was, older, leaner, dressed in a dark coat with flecks of road dust on the sleeves. His hair was shorter now, but those stormy eyes were exactly the same. For a moment, the entire world felt like it held its breath. Miguel looked at her like he'd seen a ghost. Laura looked at him like she'd seen her past walk straight through the door. No one said anything, not at first. But something had shifted, and neither of them could pretend it hadn't. The town buzzed quietly with gossip in the days that followed. San Felice didn't change often, and when it did, people noticed. Miguel's return stirred old whispers, long-forgotten memories, and questions no one dared to ask aloud. Why was he back? Why now? And most of all, would Laura let him in again? But she didn't talk about it, not even to her best friend, Marina, who had been by her side through everything. Instead, Laura buried herself in her routine, her safe haven, and Miguel, well, he didn't say much either. He walked the familiar streets with a distant look in his eyes, like he was searching for pieces of himself he'd lost along the way. What neither of them could see was that fate had already set the stage. That some stories, no matter how long they sleep, have a way of waking up when the time is right. And sometimes love doesn't come back to stay. Sometimes it comes back to test us, to show us who we've become, to ask one final question. Would you choose the same heart again, knowing it could break you twice? But the answer to that, well, you'll have to wait for it. Because this isn't just a story about love. It's a story about time, forgiveness, and the choices that shape who we are. And some choices, they change everything. Chapter 1. The First Crack in the Silence. The bell above the cafe door rang again that Thursday morning, just as it had 2 days before, when Miguel first walked in. But this time, Laura was prepared, or at least she told herself she was. She didn't look up right away. Her hands were busy polishing a ceramic mug that had long since stopped needing attention. Her breath was steady, too steady, like she was forcing calm into her veins. But her heart, it betrayed her with every beat. She knew it was him. Miguel had that kind of presence. He didn't need to speak for people to notice he was in the room. It wasn't arrogance, it was something quieter, something heavier, like his soul had weathered storms no one else could see. He stepped up to the counter. Same distance as before, not too close, not too far. "Coffee, black," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges, like it hadn't been used much lately. Laura nodded without a word and turned to pour it. The air between them tightened. When she handed him the cup, their fingers didn't touch, but it was close. Too close. And in that fraction of space, old memories rushed in like a flood, sneaking out to meet by the old bridge, arguing under the rain because he was always talking about leaving. The kiss in the school library, when they both knew it was more than just young love. Laura pulled her hand back quickly. Miguel's gaze stayed on her face. "You look different," he said. She forced a smile, one of those polite ones you give to strangers you vaguely remember. "It's been years. People change." He nodded slowly, like he was agreeing with more than just her words. "Yeah, they do." Silence. Again. That old, familiar silence. But now it was heavier. He sat at his usual table, yes, his usual one, the one he always claimed when they were younger. Back then, he'd sit there and sketch things in his notebook, buildings, faces, constellations he dreamed of chasing. Laura used to tease him, calling him the town's lost astronaut. He would just smirk and say, "Maybe I'm not lost. Maybe I'm just orbiting." She thought he was romanticizing his instability. He thought she was afraid to dream bigger. Maybe they were both right. Across the room, Miguel pulled a book from his coat, an old paperback with a cracked spine, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Laura felt a strange pang. That was the first book she ever lent him. The first story they ever talked about like it meant something more. He hadn't forgotten, but she wasn't ready for this. As the cafe filled with morning regulars, Mr. Davy with his crossword puzzle, Anna and her sleepy toddler, the two high school girls whispering over their iced lattes, Laura tried to act normal. She moved through her tasks like clockwork, smiling, pouring, nodding, but her eyes kept drifting back to him. Why was he here? Why now? And why hadn't he said more? Why? That night, Laura sat on the front steps of her father's house, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The cicadas were out, singing their shrill lullaby. The sky above was a canvas of stars, unbothered by human stories. Her father came out with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one and sat beside her, his old joints creaking with the motion. "You've been quiet," he said after a long sip. "I'm always quiet," she replied. He gave her a knowing look. "That boy. He's back." She looked at him, surprised. "How did you—" "This town has ears, remember?" he said with a half-smile. "And I'm not deaf yet." Laura laughed softly, then fell silent again. Her father let the quiet settle before speaking. "Some people return because they miss what they had. Others, because they're trying to find what they lost." She swallowed hard. And what if what they lost can't be found? Then they'll have to face the truth, he said gently. But that's their journey. Yours is choosing whether to let them walk beside you again. Laura didn't respond. She just stared at the horizon, where the last bit of twilight faded into night. The next day, Miguel came back. This time, he stayed longer, ordered another coffee, asked about a book on the shelf, made small talk with Marina when she dropped by. But he didn't speak to Laura again, not directly. But she felt him watching. When she reached for a plate, when she refilled a cup, when she adjusted the flowers near the window, his eyes followed. Not in a predatory way, but like he was trying to memorize her again. Like she was a language he used to speak fluently and was now afraid to get wrong. She hated how that made her feel, seen, vulnerable, curious. After he left, Marina cornered her behind the counter. "You okay?" her best friend asked. Laura nodded. "He's different," Marina added, "but also not." "I don't know what he wants," Laura whispered. "Maybe he doesn't either." That night, Laura opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were letters she never sent, photos she never looked at. One of them was a picture of Miguel at 17, sitting under the bridge, sketching. She stared at it for a long time before tucking it back in. Some wounds never bleed, but they ache in the quiet. And quiet was all she had right now, until Miguel broke it again. Chapter 2, Unspoken Words and Unfinished Pages. Miguel showed up again the next morning. Not early, not late. Just as Laura was wiping down the chalkboard menu near the entrance, trying to steady her breath before the day officially began. She turned, and there he was, wearing the same dark jacket, the one with frayed cuffs, and carrying that worn-out paperback under his arm again. It was as if he were waiting for the exact moment her guard would be halfway down. This time he smiled. A small one, but it was real, and it was dangerous. It reached his eyes, the same eyes that once held the entire world when he looked at her. "Morning," he said softly. She froze for a second before replying, "Morning." He took the same table, of course, and this time, instead of staring out the window or pretending to read, he opened a notebook. Not the one from the past, but a new one. Clean cover, crisp edges, a blank story, begging to be written. Laura watched from behind the counter as he scribbled something with careful attention, every now and then tapping his pen against the wood. Her chest ached, confused, angry maybe, or maybe just nostalgic. The bell rang again. Customers, more coffee, more routine. She got lost in it for a while, until he came up to the counter again. This time, it wasn't for coffee. He handed her a page torn from the notebook. No words, just a sketch, a girl leaning against a cafe window, staring out, lost in thought. Her eyes were haunting, familiar. It was her. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She blinked. "You still draw?" Miguel shrugged. "Sometimes, when I'm trying to say things I can't explain out loud." Her fingers trembled slightly as she took the sketch. "Why this?" He hesitated. His voice was low. "Because I still see you." The air between them twisted. Dense, uncomfortable, almost unbearable. Before she could respond, Marina burst through the kitchen door, breaking the moment with the clatter of a tray. Laura shoved the sketch into the drawer beneath the register and plastered on a neutral face. Miguel took the cue and returned to his seat. But the space between them stayed charged. Later that day, while stocking shelves in the back, Laura stared at the sketch again. Her eyes in the drawing weren't just sad, they were tired, quietly broken, like someone who still smiled on command but didn't know how to feel joy anymore. Was that how he saw her? Or was that what she'd become? That night, she found herself back at the old bridge, the one Miguel had always loved. It hadn't changed much. Same rusted railings, same overgrown vines. The river below still whispered secrets only they used to understand. She sat on the railing, feet dangling. Her fingers traced the initials carved into the wood, M+L, barely visible now. Time had weathered them, but they were still there, just like the ache in her chest. She didn't hear him approach until he spoke. "You still come here?" Laura didn't turn around. Not really, just today. He stood beside her but didn't sit. "Funny, I ended up here too." Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed. He finally spoke. "I thought if I came back everything would be different. Easier." "And is it?" she asked, still not looking at him. He laughed once quietly. "Not even close." She glanced at him. "Why now, Miguel?" His jaw tightened. "My father died last month." Laura's breath hitched. She hadn't known. She hadn't even asked. "I didn't come to ask for anything," he added. "I just wanted to remember something real before everything fell apart." Laura looked at him now. Really looked. He wasn't the reckless boy who used to fight the world with his dreams. He was a man carrying grief in his shoulders, guilt in his eyes, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded. "Yeah, me too. For a lot of things." They stayed there, the silence wrapping around them like an old blanket, tattered, familiar, but warm in its own way. The stars above blinked quietly. The river kept whispering, and for the first time in years, Laura didn't feel completely alone. The next few days passed like that. Slow reconnections, awkward pauses, glimpses of what used to be, and shadows of what could never be again. Miguel kept coming to the cafe. Some days he brought a sketch, other days a book. Sometimes he didn't say a word, but he stayed, and that changed everything. People noticed. Mr. Davy gave a knowing nod the third time he saw them, laughing quietly near the pastry case. Marina teased Laura relentlessly. "So the ghost returns, and suddenly my best friend is blushing like she's 16 again." Laura rolled her eyes. "It's not like that." But even she didn't believe herself, because Miguel was still unpredictable, still haunted, still half-wild in the way he looked at the world, but he was also honest now, gentler, and maybe that scared her even more, because part of her wanted to believe that people could change, that time could soften edges, that pain could teach something deeper. But another part knew how much she'd bled back then, how much she'd survived in silence, and she wasn't sure if her heart could survive being unfinished again. So she kept a wall up until the night he knocked on her door. Late, rain-soaked, hands shaking. "I need to tell you something," he said, and the look in his eyes told her that everything was about to change. Chapter 3. What the rain never said aloud. The rain poured as if the sky itself had something to confess. Miguel stood there on Laura's porch, drenched from head to toe, hair clinging to his forehead and clothes soaked through. His breath was uneven, like he'd run through the storm just to get there. Maybe he had. Laura opened the door just enough to look him in the eye. He didn't blink. "I need to tell you something." She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The warmth of the small house wrapped around them, a quiet contrast to the chaos outside. The smell of vanilla and lemon drifted from the kitchen where Laura had been baking to pass the time or avoid thinking. The same old ceramic mug, chipped on the handle, sat half-filled with tea on the table. Miguel stood just inside the doorway, water dripping onto the rug. "I'm sorry, I should have called or waited until morning." She handed him a towel and shook her head. "You came. That's what matters." He looked at her then, eyes wide and raw. "Laura, I didn't just come back because of my dad." She waited, watching him carefully. "I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about everything we never said." A pause. "And because I couldn't forgive myself for walking away." Laura stayed quiet. The air was thick with memory, like every word spoken would ripple through time. "I was scared," he said. "Back then, everything felt like too much. Your love, the future, what I was becoming. I didn't know how to carry any of it, so I ran. Not just from you, from myself." Her voice was soft but steady. "You didn't just leave, Miguel. You disappeared." "I know," he whispered, "and every day since. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd stayed." The truth hung in the room like fog, heavy, damp, impossible to ignore. "I'm not that boy anymore," he added, "but I still love you, and I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know." Laura stepped closer, searching his face for sincerity. She found it. "You think love is enough now?" she asked, not accusing, just real. He hesitated. "No, but truth is, and maybe this time that's a better place to start." She turned away and walked toward the kitchen, needing a moment, needing space between her thoughts. Miguel didn't follow. He stood still, his soaked shoes squeaking against the floor. She stared at the oven timer, blinking without really seeing it. Memories rushed her, late nights on that same porch waiting for him to show up, silent mornings crying into her pillow, her mother's arms wrapped around her, whispering that time would heal. And yet, here he was, a scar in the shape of a man. She turned back around. "You broke me, Miguel, and I spent years building myself back. Without you, I don't know if I can go through that again." He stepped forward this time, slowly, carefully. "I'm not asking for forever," he said. I am just asking for a chance to be the kind of man who would have stayed." Tears welled in her eyes. She hated how much those words cracked her. They stood there facing each other, two people who once loved loudly and now only knew how to whisper. Then, without thinking, Laura crossed the space between them and laid her head on his chest. He didn't move, just wrapped his arms around her with a gentleness that almost felt like regret. The storm outside softened to a drizzle, and in that moment, the past didn't matter. Only the sound of their hearts trying to remember how to beat in the same rhythm. The next morning was quieter, brighter. The sky stretched out in that soft blue tone that only comes after a storm. Miguel had stayed the night, on the couch. Laura hadn't offered more. He hadn't asked. She made coffee, and he made eggs. It was strange, domestic, almost normal. But beneath the surface, 1,000 unsaid things still stirred. At the cafe, people noticed immediately. Marina raised her eyebrows the moment Miguel walked in beside Laura. "Wow," she said. "Look who's not just sketching from the window anymore." Laura rolled her eyes, but she smiled, just barely. Later that afternoon, Miguel helped carry crates into storage. Their hands brushed. They didn't talk about it. But later, Laura found another sketch tucked into her apron pocket. This time, it was of both of them. Not from the past, from now. Her hair tied up, hands flour-dusted, eyes tired but present. Him beside her, notebook in hand, smiling at her like she was the only thing in the room worth noticing. No words, just a date scribbled in the corner. That day. She didn't know what that meant, but her heart stirred. 1 week passed, then 2. They started spending more time together. Walks after work, coffees on the porch, long conversations under city lights. Sometimes they laughed like nothing ever broke. Other times, the silence between them hinted at the cracks still healing. But healing they were. One evening, while lying in the park beneath the stars, Miguel whispered, "Do you think we get second chances? Real ones?" Laura looked up at the sky. "I think sometimes the universe lets us rewrite chapters, but not the whole book." He turned his head toward her. "Then let's write this one slowly." She smiled. Slowly's good. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that maybe, just maybe, some stories didn't need to be perfect to be worth telling again. Chapter 4. The day the letter arrived. The summer ended softer than it began. The cafe stayed warm with laughter and cinnamon, and Miguel's sketches lined one of the walls, framed and subtle, like silent confessions. Laura had finally agreed to let him display them, not because she'd fully forgiven him, but because something in her had softened too. Life was beginning to feel stitched together again, not perfectly but tenderly. They weren't officially together, no labels, no promises, but they shared moments. Sunsets on the dock, morning coffee with tangled hair and sleepy smiles, late-night walks under streetlights when the world felt like it belonged only to them. Until the letter came. It was a plain envelope, postmarked from Madrid. Laura found it on the counter one morning, tucked under a stack of mail. Miguel was in the shower. She turned the envelope over, heart thudding against her chest. It was addressed to Miguel, handwritten, no return address. She didn't open it, of course, but she didn't need to, because when Miguel came into the kitchen and saw it, everything in his face changed. He didn't hide it well. She sipped her coffee and asked quietly, "Who's it from?" He looked down. "My editor." Laura's stomach turned. "In Spain?" He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I sent a manuscript a while ago. Didn't think they'd respond." There was something in his voice, a tremble, a secret. She watched him carefully. "What does it say?" He hesitated, then opened the envelope, read in silence. The world felt like it paused just for a second. "They want to publish it," he said. "They're offering a contract, a full year in Madrid." The silence returned. He didn't look up. Laura swallowed. "And you want to go?" Miguel finally raised his eyes. "I don't know. I thought I did." Her heart broke in slow motion. "But now..." He reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "Now there's you, and this place, and a version of myself I didn't think existed anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You dreamed of this. You told me that years ago, before everything." "I dreamed of being seen," he whispered, "of creating something that mattered. But I never thought I'd be torn between a life I built and a love I rediscovered." Laura pulled her hand back. "You need to go," she said, voice trembling. "You have to go." His eyes widened. "What?" "You've always been running from your potential. Don't let me be another reason you shrink. But what if I lose you again?" Her voice cracked. Maybe this time we lose each other for the right reasons." He stood, trying to find words, trying to change the direction of the moment. But she stood too, stronger than before, braver. "You once left without warning," she said. "This time I'm asking you to go, and to do it knowing I love you enough to let you." Tears slid down his face and he didn't wipe them. He kissed her forehead like a final prayer. Then he left. Not angrily, not like before. This time it was gentle, quiet, like the ending of a song that will always echo in your mind. 6 months passed. Letters came, sometimes emails, occasionally a voice message with background sounds of Spanish cafes and street musicians. He told her about the book launch, about the apartment with a red door, about how the city taught him to walk slower and dream louder. She wrote back too, not as often, but with honesty. She told him how the cafe grew busier, how Marina got engaged, how the town looked different now, emptier in a beautiful, aching way. They didn't say "I miss you" often, but every word whispered it between the lines. One cold February morning, a box arrived for Laura. Inside was a single book, hardcover, cream pages, his name embossed on the cover. She opened it slowly. Her hands shook. There, on the dedication page, were just 5 words: "For the one I stayed for." Laura pressed her hand to her chest. She cried, of course, not because of loss, but because she finally understood something she never had before. Love isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about letting someone go without losing yourself in the process. 3 more months passed. Spring bloomed again. The town stretched and yawned and filled with light. Laura stood on the cafe porch, watering the small rosebush she planted that winter. She didn't expect the soft voice behind her. "Still making those lemon tarts?" She turned. Miguel stood there, suitcase beside him, eyes tired but glowing. "Thought you were coming back in June," she said. He smiled. "I finished early." Laura didn't run to him, didn't cry. She just nodded. "You hungry?" "Starving." And they walked inside. No dramatic embrace, no Hollywood music playing, just two people who had once shattered, learning how to hold each other, this time without breaking. Enjoyed this story? Then subscribe to the Golden Words channel so you won't miss any others. Every day, we bring you touching and emotional stories. Leave a comment with the city and country you're listening from. Let's spread these stories worldwide.